Welcome back to our Sunday School series on the book of Judges. This is lesson number 6 on Abimelech, Tola, and Jair from Judges chapters 9 and 10. Today we're in Judges chapter 9, and we'll do the first couple of verses of chapter 10. We're going to cover these three fellas, Abimelech, Tola, and Jair today. And what we'll do for our outline, you can see on the handout, we're going to do just a brief bit of review. We'll talk about the rise of Abimelech, and then the fall of Abimelech, and then we'll touch on these two minor judges, Tola and Jair, in the last little section. All right, a little bit of review. What we're going to look at today, especially with Abimelech, because he's the main character of this passage, is the chapter today is really an extension of the Gideon story. Okay? And so in order to get us into the context again, I want to go back and look at the last tail part of Gideon's story, and that's going to set us up to look at Abimelech. So look back at Judges chapter 8, verses 22 through 31 is where we're going to look. So when you got your finger there, look back up here, because if you'll remember, when we talk about the judges, last week we noted that Gideon is a hinge judge, meaning that at Gideon and then moving forward through the rest of the book, the dive into darkness really starts getting a lot worse really quick. So if you think about Judges a little bit like this, and let's say here's the precipice over which everybody starts going down real quick. Here's Gideon. And then up here we had all the other judges we've already talked now about, Othniel, Ehud. We had a minor judge named Shamgar up here, and then we have Deborah. And then we went to Gideon. Well, starting with Gideon, we saw how his story ended, right? He ended in a pretty dark place. But if you thought Gideon was bad, just hang on, because we're about to really take a deep dive. So Gideon's the hinge judge here who really tilts things downward. And then Abimelech is going to follow, as well as the other last two major judges who are Jephthah and Samson. So let's look back at Gideon real quick at the tail end of his life, or his story here. Verse 22 of chapter 8. Let's see. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil," for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. All right, let's stop there, and let's make a couple of notes. There are two great evils that happen in Judges, right? Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. What's the first evil? Idolatry, right? And the second one? Intermarriage with the surrounding nations, right? At the end of Gideon's story, he's doing both of these, okay? So up to this point, none of the judges we haven't seen any of these judges doing this. We've seen the people doing it in the cycle over and over and over. But now we see not only the people, but the judges are involved in the two great evils that are going on. In addition to that, here we start to see the people want a king, right? And they say, "Gideon, you come and rule over us." And Gideon gives the right answer. He says the right thing. says, no, I'm not going to do it. My son's not going to do it. The Lord's going to rule over you. But now that you mention it, he says, do this for me. Everybody give me your earrings. And what he's saying is pay me tribute. Right? He's doing exactly what a king would do. He says the right thing, but he starts acting like a king. So not only does he collect this tribute from the people, but we get this little insight here into more of Gideon by what he names his son. So in verse 31 it says he has this concubine in Shechem who bore him a son. And Gideon names his son Abimelech. Now, this is a very important name for the context of the story. It's made up of 3 Hebrew words. And Melech means king. This I means my. Anybody think they know what this might mean? Father. So, Abimelech's name means my father is the king. So Gideon said, I'm not going to rule over you. The Lord's going to do that. But here, pay me a tribute, and then I'm going to name my son, my father is the king. All right, so while Gideon, he's a savior of Israel, but he's a deeply flawed character. And we see that he's involved in idolatry, intermarriage, and then agrees to, he doesn't say he's going to do it, but then he does it. He serves as somewhat as a king figure for Israel. So he names his son Abimelech. So that sets us up as we move into chapter 9 to actually look at Abimelech himself and what's going on here. Now as we look at Abimelech, as we've seen, we're going through this cycle in the Judges, right? The people of Israel do what's evil in the sight of the Lord. God sends the enemy to punish them. They cry out for help and repent, some of them. Then there's a judge that's raised up, and then there's salvation, and then the cycle repeats itself after the death of the judge. Abimelech is not a judge, as we'll see in this passage, but he fills a hole in the story as if he were a judge. Okay? So he's not a judge, but he's a character that fits into the cycle of the judges. Now, you remember also from Gideon, in that cycle, when they repent, so they've committed evil, the Lord sends the Midianites, and they severely oppress them, and they cry out to the Lord for help, and God sends what? Instead of a judge, he sends a prophet. So we start to see the cycle breaking down from God's perspective. He said, I've sent plenty of judges already. So he sends a prophet to them, and the prophet condemns Israel for what they've been doing. And then there's a question, is God going to raise up another judge for us or not? And he does in Gideon. So God, again, his mercy is emphasizing that he continues to raise up a judge. But here we see instead of another judge being raised up, we get Abimelech. So let's start in chapter 9, and Abimelech will take us through the end of this chapter. And we'll look first at the rise of Abimelech in the first 21 verses, and then his fall in the last half of the chapter. Now, as we look, note on your handout, there are 2 pictures. On the front, there's a picture. On the back, there's a map. We'll refer to those a couple of times throughout the story. Verse 1. Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem. And their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. Now look on the back of your map real quick so you can get a little context of where we are in the nation of Israel. Shechem is right smack dab in the middle of your map. If you see the little square that says Tola, if you look just to the south of Tola, Shechem is there. And just to the east of Abdon, that's Shechem. Now we're going to see a few sites within this location that take place here with Abimelech. So they like the idea. He is our brother. Verse 4. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. Now there's something important to just take a note of here. These 70 pieces of silver. Note, first of all, that these 70 pieces of silver are taken from the temple of Baal-berith. We talked about this name before because after Gideon dies, the Israelites commit evil in the sight of the Lord again, and they go and worship this particular deity, Baal-berith. And you'll remember that if we translate this literally, Baal means Lord, and Berith is covenant. So you get Lord of the covenant. So that sounds like Yahweh, right? Right? Sounds like Yahweh. But what we have here is some syncretism, a mixing of the true religion with the Canaanite religions that are around it. So they take 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and we'll see why they choose 70 pieces here in a second. Look at verse 5. Abimelech went to his father's house at Ophrah. All right, if you look on the map, just so you can see where he's going. Ophrah is north of Shechem, across the border into the tribe of Issachar, which is where Gideon settled. So he's going all the way north, a good little trip here to Ophrah. And while he's there, he kills his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. Okay? So why do they pay him 70 pieces of silver? It's a piece of silver for every brother. All right? He said, that's his plan. I'm going to go kill all my brothers. So pay me to do it so I can hire some people to go and do it. So not only well, let's think about this for a second. At the end of the story of Gideon, you remember he's pursuing these two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna. And why is he going to kill Zebah and Zalmunna? Do you remember? They've done something to him, and they kill his brothers. All right, so Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian, kill all of Gideon's brothers at some conflict. And so Gideon has a personal vendetta against these guys, and he kills them. So not only are Gideon's brothers killed, all right, but now Gideon's sons are killed by their own brother. So we've taken a step deeper down into the darkness as Gideon's own sons wipe out his entire legacy. Almost. Because look at verse number 6. At the end of verse 5, actually, there's one last sentence. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. And all the leaders of Shechem came together, and all Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. Now let's make a couple of other notes here. He kills his brothers all on one stone. Okay? Basically what he's doing is sacrificing his brothers to Baal-berith. All right? Doesn't say that's explicitly what he's doing, but that's what's happening here, right? The Lord of the covenant pays Abimelech to go and kill his brothers, who he offers up on one stone to this false god. So this is going to come back, this idea here, in a little bit. And if you look on the front page of your handout, this is the actual temple of Baal-berith in Shechem. It has been uncovered by archaeology, and you can see its structure there. Even there's a large standing stone on the nearest end as you look at the picture. So we know exactly where this is taking place, where he's being paid from, and in this location is going to show up again at the end of the chapter in an important scene that takes place with Abimelech. So Jotham escapes. He's the youngest son of Gideon. Real quick at the end of verse 6, in the Hebrew, it says that they made Abimelech king. You remember the word for king is Melech. So they made Abimelech Melech. So no longer is he, my father is the king, but now Abimelech is Melech. All right, so there's this little play on the words there. They make Abimelech Melech, and so he becomes the king. Now, verse 7, Jotham's going to do something important here. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them. Now, look again real quick on the map. There's a little triangle that says Mount Gerizim just to the south of Shechem. And if you look at a picture of Shechem, and you can kind of see it here on the front. These might not be the exact mountains, but Shechem lies in between these two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And it's not like Mount Everest on each side of Shechem, but it's these large hills. And so Jotham goes and stands on Mount Gerizim and calls out to the city of Shechem. Now, part of the thing that you might notice on the map there is that he's just inside the tribal boundary, or right on the boundary between Manasseh and the tribe just to the south. All right, so he's going to call, and then he's out of there. All right, and he's got a quick escape as he moves away from Shechem. So look at verse 7. When it was told to Jotham, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, that is the people of Shechem, listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored and go hold sway over the trees? And the trees said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? And the trees said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. So Jotham tells this little, it's not a parable, but it's a little anecdote illustration. Who are the trees? Those are the people of Shechem, right? And they're trying to bring somebody to be their king, and they ask the olive tree to do it. They ask the grapevine to do it. And then they ask the fig tree to do it. The fig tree second. Now, these three agricultural crops were really important to Israel. They would have been well known to the people of Shechem. They're used regularly in all sorts of ceremonial rituals and practices. They're not going to leave their appropriate place to come and reign over them, but instead they call out to the bramble to come and reign over them. So what's a bramble?
Weed.
Yeah, weed, and most often it's just used as kindling to start a fire, right? So he says, the bramble says, okay, I'll come do it. But Jotham says, may fire come out of the bramble and devour the trees of Lebanon. All right, so hang on to that as Jotham says this to the people of Shechem, because it is going to be fulfilled later in the chapter. So note now at verse 16, Jotham continues, now therefore if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as his deeds deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian, and you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech, the son of his female servant, king over the leaders of Shechem, because he is your relative. If you then have acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out of Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of Abimelech his brother. Now a quick note about Jotham's name. We've noticed before that names are important, right? So Jotham's name in the Hebrew is Yotam. And Yo is an abbreviation of Yahweh. All right, and here Tam is the word for complete or perfection. So his name could mean something like Yahweh is perfect, or it could also mean something like may Yahweh complete, or may Yahweh fulfill. And what's going to happen is Jotham speaks this word to the people of Shechem and to Abimelech. May fire come out of Abimelech and destroy you, and may fire come out of you and destroy Abimelech. And what happens is Yotam, may God complete. God does exactly that with what Jotham says, with what Yotam says to the people of Shechem. So his name actually points us to what's going to happen with what he says to the people of Shechem. Now, as we see at the end here in verse 20, there's this double destruction that he asks to happen. Not only does he pray or say that hopefully Abimelech will destroy Shechem, but the people of Shechem will also destroy Abimelech. And that's what's going to happen in the last half of chapter 9. So what Yotam says is fulfilled by God or is completed by God, which is what his name can be. Now we also see he says this, if you have acted in good faith, and if you have acted in integrity in making Abimelech your king, then you can rejoice. But if you haven't, and then he goes on this long little diatribe about all the things that they have done to go against Jerubbaal and against Gideon. Well, this is fulfillment and explains chapter 8, verse 35. Because at the end of Gideon's life, when he dies, it says the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals, namely Baal Berith. And the people of Israel did not remember Yahweh their God, who had delivered them from the hand of their enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. No, they didn't. Especially Abimelech. All right? He wipes out all of his sons, except for Yotam. And the people of Shechem act in the same way. So we see exactly what 8:35 is talking about here at the middle point of Jotham's speech to the people of Shechem. Now he runs away and flees to a place called Beer. Beer means well, W-E-L-L. We don't know where this particular well is. It's not made explicit in the text where he runs to, but he gets out of there for his own life, somewhere far away, enough to be safe from the people of Shechem and from Abimelech. Now that brings us to the beginning of the end for Abimelech. So let's pick up now with the rest of the story. The fall of Abimelech, starting in verse 22. And as we go through this passage, Abimelech is going to look like some other prominent character in the Old Testament. So I'll point it out as we go along, but see if you can pick it out before as we get there. He's going to look like some other prominent character in the Old Testament, which we have not yet come to. So let's begin in verse 22. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. And the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. All right, here's a little bit of foreshadowing. Just as Jotham said, may they destroy each other. He's setting us up for it. Now we notice that at the beginning here, here's the first little tie from Abimelech to this other character. In verse 23, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. Do you remember anybody else who receives an evil spirit from the Lord? It's Saul, okay? It's King Saul. So think about this. The author is most likely writing the book of Judges after the divided kingdom. So 922 BC. All right? So we've had King Saul, we've had King David, we've had King Solomon, and then the kingdom splits between the northern and southern kingdoms. And so the author, as we've already noted, the primary purpose for Judges is an apologetic or a reason for the Davidic monarchy. Okay? And so we've also noticed as we've come through the book of Judges that there's been pro-Judah stuff and there's been anti-Benjamin stuff. Right? Pro-Judah, which is David's tribe, anti-Benjamin, which is Saul's tribe, making the point for the reign of a Davidic king. Okay, so in verse 25, let's see. The leaders of Shechem put men in ambush against Abimelech on the mountaintops, and they robbed all who passed by them along that way. And it was told to Abimelech. Now, if you remember, back at the beginning, they pay Abimelech 70 pieces of silver. What does he do with that money? Well, he hires, it says, worthless and reckless men to go and help him kill his brothers. It would not surprise me if these are the same exact group of worthless and reckless men now that the Shechemites are hiring against Abimelech. All right? And so they hired the same dudes, the same band of ruffians out there, and they set them now in ambush against Abimelech. And verse 26. Gaal, the son of Ebed, moved into Shechem with his relatives, and the leaders of Shechem put confidence in him. And they went out into the field and gathered the grapes from their vineyards and trod them and held a festival. And they went into the house of their god, Baal-berith, and you see the temple there. They went into the house of their god and ate and drank and reviled Abimelech. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, "Who is Abimelech? And who are we of Shechem that we should serve him?" Now this is a great drunken speech here. "Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, and is not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him?" So what do you say? Hamor is his ancestor, as opposed to Abimelech's line of the family. "Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem, but why should we serve him?" That is Abimelech. "Would that this people were under my hand, then I would remove Abimelech. I would say to Abimelech, increase your army and come out." Right? He's a real big man, right? And I can imagine him, right? He's got a glass full of wine standing up in front of everybody, and he's drunk, and he's making all of these brash claims and ready to fight Abimelech. Now in verse 30, when Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger was kindled, and he sent messengers to Abimelech secretly, saying, "Behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come to Shechem, and they are stirring up the city against you. Now therefore, go by night, you and the people who are with you, and set an ambush in the field. Then in the morning, as soon as the sun is up, rise early and rush upon the city. And when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you may do to them as your hand finds to do." All right, now this really gives you a clear understanding of what in the world is going on in Israel at this time. It's every house divided against another, right? Not just the tribes, but these are people within one tribe that are constantly ambushing each other, hiring people to assassinate one another. So Israel's in a bad state as we see these families turning against each other. In verse 34, Abimelech and all the men who were with him rose up by night and set an ambush against Shechem in 4 companies. And Gaal, the son of Ebed, went out and stood in the entrance of the gate of the city. And Abimelech and the people who were with him rose from the ambush. And when Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the mountaintops." And Zebul said to him, "You mistake the shadow of the mountains for men." Gaal spoke again and said, "Look, people are coming down from the center of the land, and one company is coming from the direction of the diviner's oak." Then Zebul said to him, "Where is your mouth now, you who said, 'Who is Abimelech, that we should serve him?' Are not these the people whom you despised? Go out now and fight with them." And Gaal went out at the head of the leaders of Shechem and fought with Abimelech. And Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. Now Abimelech lived at Arumah, and Zebul drove out Gaal and his relatives so that they could not dwell at Shechem. That's kind of a little parenthetical remark by the writer of the book here. If you look on the back of your map again, you can see where Arumah is. You've got kind of a triangle from Shechem to Mount Gerizim to Arumah there in the center of your map. So that's where Abimelech was staying, and then the men of Shechem came out to war against him. Now in verse 42, on the following day, the people went out into the field, and Abimelech was told. Now let me ask you a question. Think about what's probably going on here. There's been this major battle, and it says people were wounded and died all the way up to what? The entrance of the gate of the city. Now the next day, people are coming out into the field. Why do you think they're coming out into the field? Yeah, to get the dead from the battle. All right, so on the following day, the people went out into the field, and Abimelech was told. He took his people and divided them into 3 companies and set an ambush in the fields. And he looked and saw the people coming out of the city, so he rose against them and killed them. Now, that's just particularly depraved, right? He's not even going to show them the mercy to come out and retrieve their loved ones from the battlefield. Instead, he's going to use that as an opportunity to wipe the rest of them out. And so in verse 44, he does that. Abimelech and the company that was with him rushed forward and stood at the entrance of the gate of the city, while the two companies rushed upon all who were in the field and killed them. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. And this is a really important phrase here, that Abimelech raises the city and sows it with salt. Now, practically, you know what that means. Why does he throw salt on it? Yeah, it's going to be barren, right? It's going to remove the chance for anything to grow or produce there. But aside from that specific practical aspect of the use of the salt, there's a theological importance behind this phrase. So flip back to Deuteronomy chapter 29. And we'll start at verse 16, and we'll read 10 verses here. This is the tail end of the covenant curses that Moses lays out in Deuteronomy. He says in verse 16, "You know how we lived in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed, and you have seen their detestable things, their idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold, which were among them. Beware, lest there be among you a man or woman or clan or tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations." All right, that's what's happening in our story. "Beware, lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, one who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, 'I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart.' This will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. The Lord will not be willing to forgive him, but rather the anger of the Lord and his jealousy will smoke against that man. And the curses written in this book will settle upon him. And the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord will single him out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity, in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in the book of the law. And the next generation, your children who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a far land, will say when they see the afflictions of that land and the sicknesses with which the Lord made it sick, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown and nothing growing, where no plant can sprout, or overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and wrath. All the nations will say, 'Why has the Lord done thus to this land? What caused the heat of his great anger?' Then people will say, 'It is because they abandoned the covenant of Yahweh, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them.'" All right, that's what the author's doing by quoting this passage, that Abimelech came in and razed the city and sowed it with salt. It wasn't even the foreigners who came in and did that, but it was the Israelites themselves, one against another, who was doing this to each other because of their turning away from Yahweh of the covenant, and they're turning to Baal of the covenant. Right? So they've turned and worshipped the false gods, just as Moses warned them not to do in Deuteronomy 29. And so the curses that he lists out there, we see coming to fruition in the life of Abimelech, specifically in our passage today, as he's the one who brings these covenant curses not only on those that he raises the city, but upon himself as well. So a really important passage that's alluded to with this idea here. Now in verse 46, we'll see the Tower of Shechem coming again. When all the leaders of the Tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the stronghold of the house of El-Berith. Well, that's what you're looking at on the front of your handout. That's the house of El-Berith. That's the Tower of Shechem. They all run in there to hide. And Abimelech was told that all the leaders of the Tower of Shechem were gathered together. And Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him. And Abimelech took an axe in his hand and cut down a bundle of brushwood and took it up and laid it on his shoulder. And he said to the men who are with him, "What you have seen me do, Hurry and do as I have done. That sounds exactly like his dad. Gideon says almost the exact same thing. So he learns from his father this same tactic. He goes up, cuts down these brushes, and brings them down with him to the Tower of Shechem. So in verse 49, every one of the people cut down his bundle, and following Abimelech, put it against the stronghold. And they set the stronghold on fire over them, so that all the people of the Tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. They smoke them out and burn them to death in the tower. Then Abimelech went to Thebez and encamped against Thebez and captured it. But there was a strong tower within the city, and all the men and women and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in, and they went up to the roof of the tower. All right, hang on here, because what we're seeing is a flip happens, right? So there's a tower. All the people go and hide and Shechem in the tower, and Abimelech kills them all in the tower. Now we're moving to a different site, and there's a tower, and all the people run into the tower to hide. And so Abimelech comes up to the tower. Verse 51, they went up to the roof of the tower. In 52, Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. Right? He's just doing a repeat of what worked before. Everybody come and do like me. And he goes up to the door. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. All right, let's stop and make a few comments about this verse. Number one, we've seen this in the story of Deborah, that the women were fulfilling the roles that the men should have been fulfilling, right? And we see a certain man killed in the story of Deborah by a woman. And that's all supposed to be humiliating, right? Because it's Sisera, the general of the army, who's killed by a woman. And here we see Abimelech, the king, right, come up to the tower, and a woman drops an upper millstone on his head and crushes his skull. So it's almost the exact same type of death that Sisera experiences in the story of Deborah. And what happens to Sisera? How is his skull crushed? Jael slams his tent peg through his skull into the ground, and he's crushed. But the difference is, in that story, Sisera is the enemy from a foreign army. But here we have the so-called king of Israel, and his head is crushed by a woman. So no longer is it some outside enemy force that is experiencing such a horrendous death. Now it's within the country themselves, within the nation itself of Israel, that their so-called king experiences the humiliation of having his skull crushed by a woman. Now, an upper millstone, if you've ever seen what this looks like in Israel, these are very common as they do archaeological digs. You've got one lower millstone where they would put the grain or barley or anything like that. And then they have another millstone that goes on top of that, and they spin it around, right? And it crushes and grinds the grain down, so that can be used for flour. So this upper millstone is movable, so it would have been removed. And it's not like something incredibly giant. This would have been like a household type of tool. So enough for her to have been able to lift it up and chunk it over the side of the tower, right? And so she takes this, lifts it up over the side of the tower, and it hits Abimelech right on the head and crushes his skull. Now, the imagery here also should take you all the way back to Genesis, right? Because there's the same language used about the coming Messiah who's going to crush the skull of the serpent. So we see Sisera in Deborah's story, the enemy, he's on the side of the serpent, right? He's the bad guy, and he gets his skull crushed. And everybody's like, yes, Jael, she's a real woman crushing the skull of the serpent here. But now the one who has his head crushed is from the nation of Israel itself. So now they're identified with the side of the serpent, having their head crushed in this way. So that's just the emphasis upon this idea of we've gone over the cliff now as far as the darkness and evil is concerned in Israel. Gideon's here, and then it's a quick drop down to the bottom, as now Abimelech, his son, has his head crushed the same way Sisera does, and in the same line as the serpent from Genesis 3:15. Now that takes us up to verse 53. In verse 54, Abimelech calls quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed him." And his young man thrust him through, and he died. And that should sound familiar to you as well. Who does that sound like? Saul. All right. So here's the second instance in which Abimelech is tied to Saul. Abimelech's on the side of the serpent. Abimelech's killed by a woman. Abimelech looks just like Saul. So is that the kind of king you want to follow? No, that's the point that the author's trying to make, right? So his young man thrust him through and he died. Verse 53, when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everybody departed to his home. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. So we see Jotham, Yahweh completes. May Yahweh complete the word that he spoke. Yahweh completed it by the end of this little pericope, this little section. Not only does Abimelech destroy the leaders of Shechem, but Abimelech himself is destroyed as well because of this warfare that's going on. Notice again, at the beginning, who sends the evil spirit? It's God. At the end, who fulfills the word? It's God. So now, instead of a judge being raised up, God acts as a judge in judgment upon Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem here in this story. So that brings us to the end of Abimelech. Now, we've got two minor judges in the first 5 verses of chapter 10. That's Tola and Jair. And we've already met at least one minor judge in Shamgar earlier in the book. So here we have 2 more. 10 verse 1. After Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola, the son of Puah, son of Dodo, a man of Issachar, and he lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. If you look on your map, you can see his hometown. They've got a little rectangle with his name in it right in the center, and Shamir. Now notice that the Shamir is not far from where Shechem and Arumah and Mount Gerizim are, right in the same general vicinity of what we've just read from Abimelech and his story. And here we see this important word in the book of Judges come up again, just to remind you who these people are. In verse 1, it says that Tola was raised to save Israel, right? And here's the Hebrew word again. That's the root word here, yasha, and that is, remember that the judges do this and are this. That is, they are saviors and they save Israel. Well, that's supposed to point you to somebody else, right? Yeshua, right? To Jesus. And so we see again in Tola's story, just this one little mention to click your mind back into place, that these judges are saviors that point us to a greater Savior in Jesus Christ. So he's a man of Issachar, and he lived at Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim, and he judged Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried at Shamir. So we've got Tola judging 23 years. So who's the judge before him? It's Gideon. How many years did he judge? There was peace in Israel for 40 years. Then in Deborah's story, it was 40. In Ehud, it was 80. And in Othniel, it was 40. And so we kind of talked about this last year. This is looking pretty good here. But now we're starting to see a pattern emerge that's going to go down in this direction here. All right, so he judges Israel for 23 years. Then he dies and is buried at Shamir. Now after him arose Jair the Gileadite, who judged Israel 22 years. It's just 1 year different, but it's headed in that direction. 1 year different. And he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys, and they had 30 cities, called Havoth Jair to this day, which are in the land of Gilead. And Jair died and was buried in Kamon. Now, what's the point in saying that he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys who had 30 cities? They're wealthy. It's a wealthy family. Now you need to at least be aware that this is not the first time that a person named Jair, who Havoth means cities or dwellings, is mentioned in the Bible, because some people may want to try to trip you up with this. But there is a Jair mentioned in Numbers Numbers 32:41 mentions the same thing, that there's a man of Jair named Jair who goes in to the land of Gilead and conquers a number of cities, and they're called Havoth Jair in Numbers. Now, are Numbers and Judges written at the same time? No. Okay. So the question is this Jair and Judges the same Jair in Numbers, who's also mentioned in Deuteronomy, and then there's a Jair also mentioned in 1 Chronicles. And some people will try to explain this by saying that there's just been a mistake in the passing down of these stories, and the author of Judges got confused and took the guy from Numbers and put him into the story here. But what we see, there's a simple explanation for this, because there's also a difference. If you look at 1 Chronicles, it says the number of cities that he has is 23. Here in Judges, it says the number of cities is 30. So not only did they move the person to the wrong place, but now they're getting the number of cities wrong. See, these guys didn't know what they were talking about. But there's a simple answer for this. The Jair in Judges is a descendant of the Jair in Numbers. And the cities that the Jair in Numbers conquered still belongs to his family and tribe at the time that Judges is written. And they're still called by this same name, the cities of Jair. Now in Chronicles, the original number of cities that would have been captured was 23, but by the time of Judges, they've added to that number of cities that they conquer and rule. So this Jair in Judges is most likely, we can't say this is certainly what's happening, but this is a clear possibility that the Jair in Judges is a descendant of the Jair in Numbers, whose families still own and run the same group of villages and cities by the time of the Judges. So if that ever comes up in a conversation, you've got an answer for it now. But that is something to be aware of at least. We meet these minor judges a couple times throughout the book, and there's not much said about them, and probably the reason is that it was peaceful during that time. So there's not a lot to say during the time of peace, right? That's a great time to be there. So there's not a whole lot of treachery and heinous murders and ambushes and stuff going on that we've been seeing during the times where there's a lot of tribulation and stuff going on with the other judges. So Israel gets a little bit of a respite after Abimelech, as Tola and Jair judge Israel for 23 and then 22 years. Now we're going to continue down that deep dive next time with the next judge, which is Jephthah. And he takes a deep dive too. Now, I keep emphasizing the deep dive that these guys are taking into darkness, but let me remind you that in Hebrews chapter 11, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, they're all listed in the Hall of Fame of Faith, all right? Which is a real comfort to me, because I know how sinful I am, and that they're included in the Hall of Fame of Faith. It gives me great comfort knowing that, okay, if God can use these guys and bring them into his family, he can use me and you and bring you into his family as well. And so that should be an encouragement to you. In spite of the darkness that's happening, God still is a Savior to these men as well. You've been listening to lesson number 6 in our Sunday School series on the book of Judges. This has been Judges 9 and 10 on Abimelech, Tola, and Jair.